So Tanya, here you are the CEO of WWF-UK. One of the wonderful things about your support as WWF for Celebration Earth is that it's given us a chance to experiment with what is now the foundational vision of 8 billion and to collect stories, to give people the time, the energy, the resources to tell their stories, to be creative in the way they tell their stories. And this has led into this notion of 8 billion, that it's about collecting stories. It's an online virtual world which has become, in the space between when you and I first talked about this, a revolution in the way we think. So it's going to be powerful. It's 10 years. It's going to pick up on stories. We're going to follow some stories every year. Others will be coming on all the time.
It is our only home, and we are all in this together.
When we all unite, we can overcome the most difficult of challenges.
Let's continue to look after each other and to make our voices heard.
There is no planet B, and this is our chance to save what we have.
What kind of stories do you already know or see or hear about? Are we going to go for the famous? Are we going to go for the people who should be famous? What's your sense? What are you looking for?
I think the importance of a platform like 8 billion and the reason we're so keen to support it is it actually starts to bring to life the stories that aren't told and aren't shared. You know, we've heard some incredible stories of people who over decades have gone out every day and planted a tree. But we've also seen reported around the world some much better known stories. If we think of the creation of Fridays for Future, Greta Thunberg sitting outside this Parliament in Stockholm and school striking, and she utterly has and continues to inspire a movement. So how do we create a setting where those stories are shared, but actually inspires others to go and do something themselves?
I remember coming to meet you about 2 years ago, and you said, so, you know, we've got this crisis year coming up, the faith, what are they going to do about the great crisis? And I was a little offhand, and I do apologise, but I sort of said, well, they're just going to carry on doing what they do anyway, and you looked slightly surprised that they were doing anything. And then you said, yes, but what would they do? And I said, well, we'd probably have a party. And to my absolute delight, you went, oh, why? Why was that something that rang a chord for you in the midst of an organisation that is better known for telling us that we're all going to hell in a handcart?
I think there's a lot to celebrate about our natural world, and whilst we must tell some truths, which we often do with science, and we share a lot of data, a lot of historical data and projections, we also do need to ensure that that is based on hope. The fate of our planet isn't a done deal. And I think by celebrating, by acknowledging what we have and how we must protect the preciousness of it, I think it's easier then for us to start to think how we can then rebuild it and ensure that we can steward it for future generations as well.
Do you find that that's an approach that is common amongst the environmentalists you work with, or do they prefer to deal with data? Do they find the emotional world a difficult one, the world of beliefs and values in that way?
I think it really varies. There's no doubt that we have some really top-class scientists who want to demonstrate as much detailed data as possible, whether it's through any range of samples, of correlations, of modelling. And these are incredible brains who have, in many ways, brought to the fore the things that we probably knew were happening in front of our eyes, but we weren't really confronting them. However, I do also think there's another side of the environmental movement that loves and adores and wants to live and exist in nature. And I think many feel very frightened by what is being lost, and they feel passionately about that. And I think we sort of move between, let's just share the facts and the data and hope that the world will respond, through to actually just wanting to exist and nurture and care for nature. I think the reality is there's different roles for both, but what we must never do is let people lose hope.
You'll hear through the many different stories that will be told that that's absolutely fundamental to what people are doing. And you then agreed to sponsor Celebration Earth. Sadly, we were not able to end up in a magnificent cathedral, but out of this has come major commitments by over 70 major faiths around the world to develop long-term plans to protect the environment. This film has come out of it. A lot of that is based around storytelling. How common is, in my experience, storytelling as an actual technique is not that respected or common in the environmental movement. We do it anyway, but we don't give it much credence. What's your sense of the role of stories?
I think the role of stories is incredibly important. My own family heritage, my mother was one of 12 surviving children. Storytelling in that kitchen in Ireland was very important. It was a major source of entertainment, but it was a major source of sharing knowledge, feelings and perspectives. And we know we respond to stories, we remember stories. So I think that it's important in society regardless in terms of how we live our lives. But I also think it is important for the environmental movement at this point in time, because what story do we want to be told? We need to think about what we want our future stories to be. And just sharing data and facts and science won't do it. It helps contribute to a story, but it's not the story itself. And that's where we need to hear from communities themselves in terms of what they're thinking, feeling, what they're seeing and witnessing every single day. And it's only by those witness statements that I think that we'll have the motivation as well as the insight to tackle these issues.
And in terms of that sort of richness of stories, one of the other trends, not just within the environmental movement, but pretty much almost anything that comes out of the Western philosophical world, is if only everybody would agree with us, then the world would be a better place, whether that's politics or faith or environment or economics. One of the things I think that comes out of these programs is the centrality of diversity. Now, we talk about biodiversity. What's your sense of what I would call cultural narrative values diversity? Does that alarm you because it doesn't mean everybody will eventually end up believing the same thing, or we might hope so? Or do you see it as a strength? What's your sense on that dichotomy, if you like?
Absolutely, unquestionably a strength. Diversity, we know in the natural world the prospect of a monoculture is not healthy, but also in our daily lives. The richness, the differing perspectives, the solutions, the life that comes from diversity in all forms and quarters is essential. And even if we look at some of the greatest challenges that we face on our planet today, they're not going to be resolved by one route or one set of solutions. The settings, the landscapes, the seascapes, the needs of local communities and how they're blended, they have different stories and different outcomes and different approaches to how we will resolve them together. So for me, we live on one of the most diverse settings in this universe, as far as we know.
As far as we know, yeah, so far.
But the prospect of not cherishing that and enabling it, that feels as though it's pushing against nature and pushing against our world.
There's a lot of talk now of moving beyond the sort of silos of separate environmental groups, each kind of pursuing their own membership and so forth, towards a mass movement or mass movements. Again, what's your sense of what a mass movement, if it's to come about, if that is a priority for WWF, what would that look like? In your vision, what does that mass movement look like, and where would it take us in 10 years?
I think for me a mass movement's essential. WWF can only play a part in hopefully inspiring, perhaps sometimes educating, often standing alongside and indeed supporting change. We should never for a minute imagine that we have all the solutions. We both know that's absolutely not the case.
We've seen that
It
occasionally.
really would not be the case, but we have to play our part though. I mean, there's no doubt in the 60-year history of WWF we've seen some of the most shocking declines of biodiversity, of species, of the very precious web of life, and that's accelerated. We have seen this great acceleration of this loss. So what role can we play at this point to ensure that we can't turn the clock, what we can do is really start to look at how we halt the sheer scale destruction of our natural world and actually move it into restoration. I often say, how do we give it back? This is a natural heritage for all life on Earth, including our own children. But when are we going to put it back? And let's give it back. And how can we create a setting or support a setting where billions of us on this planet want to play their part in it too?
What is your sense, both personally and professionally, about the significance of this growing partnership between the faiths and the major environmental organisations, given that WWF started this whole thing back in Assisi in 1986?
When I look at so many faith groups, it is that cultural heritage, the tradition, the values that sit around all the faiths that many of us have the pleasure and the honour to meet. And how can we speak to and share our knowledge, both scientific, also in terms of the settings we work in the world, to help those faiths think about how they might wish to play their part. We know that there are so many traditions that speak long beyond the life of the 60 short years of WWF in terms of care of the environment, the one place we can all call home. We know many faiths explicitly prohibit the excessive use of resources, that they absolutely acknowledge that faith and the role is to protect the local environment and indeed all the resources that come with it. So I think what we can do is join hands, support, perhaps play a foundational role to assist them in terms of how, as a faith, they would like to respond to one of the greatest, if not the greatest, challenge of our time. And more power to those groups to do that.
Celebration Earth has been this sort of triumvirate or a triangle. So we have the environmental movements, including WWF and RSPB and others. We have the faiths. And then we have the arts. WWF doesn't have much of a programme with the arts at the moment. This is, a foothold into this. Again, what would be your vision of the engagement with arts, and where would that be in 10 years' time for WWF's use, engagement and contribution towards the arts as a vehicle for the mass movement? Does it have a place in the mass movement?
I would hope so, because the issues that we're facing, and I think at times the green movement has almost been treated as a bolt-on. These are mainstream, cross-cutting issues across society. I was referencing with a colleague that a couple of years ago, when we launched our last Living Planet report, a very heavy piece of science. I was most delighted that it made its way onto a comedy show on the radio. That, for me, means the issues are cutting through. Yeah. So how can we ensure that this feels societal, that we do feel it viscerally, that it's not in a scientific report or a facts-based information? Those are important pillars, but it has to be cross-cutting, it has to be something that we all care about. And I think what we've detected is that arts is kind of coming to find us as opposed to us finding them. And perhaps how we open our doors, arms, and learn and engage with some of the incredible range of arts is going to be very important. I would say one thing we have done in terms of engagement is we have moved into telling stories in terms of some of the mass social media, and certainly in terms of film. That we feel quite comfortable in, but I think we can stretch our roots, if you like, much, much further. Having
worked with WWF for a very long time, there was always this tendency or trend to want to brand, to want to say, that's our property, make sure you acknowledge that. Does that have to give way now to more a sense of what can we support rather than what can we be profiled as? And how does that, because very often that affects fundraising and a sense of profile. What does this mass movement mean for the self-assessment of what WWF is there for?
My sense is it's already shifted. I think there are moments when it's sensible to have a brand in terms of a conversation perhaps with a political leader, or in an environment where we're particularly trying to put a very specific point across. But we shouldn't be slavish about it. And what we have increasingly tried to do is look at how we can either work behind the scenes, how we can work perhaps a little bit more quietly with communities or other groups so that they may put forward their voices. So my feeling is that this isn't about branding, it certainly isn't about fundraising. We're incredibly lucky to have the support we have. We treasure and value that. This is about how we're going to make a difference, and a very significant difference. And if we don't tackle some of the greatest threats to our planet and the life on Earth in the next 10 years, then I think we'll face a very different future. And certainly, again, our children will as well.
Now, part of the work, or part of the programme for next year, for the 60th anniversary, is to help launch this idea of the 8 billion. This notion that creating a space, a place where people can send their stories, upload their stories, tell their stories. And WWF has been the main driving force, really, behind that. What do you hope will come out of that?
I think one of our values is how can we create the impact on the scale of the challenges that we know we face. And there's never just one thing that can be done. For me, it's around the breadth of things that we do. But the prospect of not looking to find ways to hopefully engage, inspire, involve up to 8 billion voices around the world feels the wrong thing to not do. That is effectively the heartland for this issue. We all live and breathe and rely on the Earth's very rich resources every day. It's our life support machine. And I think if we can inspire just a few communities to think about what they might do and the stories that they tell and share, it will once again, I hope, mainstream the very challenges ahead, but actually the hope and the possibilities. We have the chance to create an incredible home for ourselves. We already have all the ingredients. Why would we not connect billions of voices around the world to think about and to consider the one place we can call home?
That reflects very much on what the Pope says in Laudato Si, his great encyclical brought out in 2015, which is, for the first time ever in the Catholic Church, a letter to the world and to all people of goodwill. And that invitation has been taken up very broadly. In your experience, in the couple of years, 3 years now is it, I think, with WWF, what has surprised you most? What has shocked you most? What has given you most hope?
I think what shocked me most when I started was I was shocked by the gravity of the ecological, the environmental crisis that we faced. It felt like the greatest untold story of our time, and that it had been put off with a whole range of paper promises, if you like, from any range of leaders in and around the world. And I felt only if there was an opportunity to tell that story, to speak to people's hearts, that there was perhaps a chance, just a chance, that we might start to move in the direction that means we could preserve and indeed bring back or restore what we have. I guess what's perhaps given me most hope has been some of the response that we have seen, and many groups, many organisations have helped this, but particularly in terms of the younger generation. You know, we know that this is the generation that will inherit potentially the problems for the future, and their sheer articulation and determination to want to do something about it, that has absolutely given me hope. But I think I would also say that I have been given a lot of hope from a lot of the older generation. Many have quietly admitted to me that they have sat in the dark hours and wondered what damage they may have inadvertently done through their businesses, through their political decisions, and really have made a personal commitment that they know that they want to change this. So I think that many are listening, but that's not to say that all are yet, or that all are on a pathway together, or a series of pathways that may start to tackle it. And again, that's obviously the warning bell that we're calling today.
Talking of warning bells, you just raised an interesting point about people almost being paralysed by fear, by a sense of failure, a sense of guilt and responsibility. I've worked with WWF for over 40 years. We've had many campaigns to change people's minds, but very little engagement with the psychiatric world, the psychoanalytical world, the psychotherapy world, or indeed with the wisdom that lies within the faiths about how you deal with traumas, with collapse, with distress, with death. Is there a role within WWF or within the environmental movement for more ritual to actually help us articulate what otherwise we keep bottled up?
So undoubtedly, I think that there is a lot of bottled up fear and anxiety around the future and indeed what we could face, as well as, of course, we know the hope. But if I guess we deal with the question of anxiety and how nature or psychoanalysts and support might play a role, I mean, I think the answers are there in front of us. Nature, undoubtedly, by stepping into nature, by being a part of nature, that has incredible benefits in terms of well-being. We've seen it through the COVID crisis, we'll continue to see it. I do think there is a role, and we've certainly published some reports recently, where we could highlight the benefits of nature to society in general for its intrinsic value. It doesn't have to have an extrinsic value for us to rely on it. But I would also invite those other communities to step forward in terms of how they might highlight some of, again, the many traditional practices, whether it's forest bathing, that we know nature brings to us as well.
Now, you talked just then about the intrinsic value of nature, yet I've watched over the 40 years a very strong drift within the environmental movement at an international level when dealing with governments and business of its value for humanity, the ecosystem deliverables, the sense that, you know, thousands of millions of years of evolution took place so we could actually drive our cars so long as we pay somebody else to plant a tree. I think there is a real tension there, and many of the faiths find that focus on the utilitarian nature of nature, i.e., is it useful to us, then it's worth saving. In working as you do, making massively significant choices about resources and areas to work, how important is the intrinsic worth of nature for itself, not just because it's useful to us? Or do we now always, because we're on the brink, have to prove it has a human value if it's to have a natural value? Where do you find in your decision making and the discussions you have to be part of, not just within WWF, with government and agencies, where do you find yourself on that?
We found we have to bring in both arguments, but I don't think it's hard to have just one or the other. For me, it's the breadth. And again, the pandemic has highlighted the intrinsic value of nature in terms of our ability to be within it. Giving a financial value to nature has helped some of the arguments when we talk about natural capital. If we give a comparison, why would we put a value on Amazon, the company, but not Amazon as a rainforest and all it gives in terms of carbon sequestration, the sky rivers and much, much more. But I think we have to acknowledge both in order to bring the whole with us, as it were. But I would hate for us to only be sat on one side of the fence or the other. For me, this is about a huge waterfront and how we start to lay out the value of our natural world, but not only by putting a price tag on it.
And in terms of a mass movement, is your sense that that mass movement is going to be something that will need to be controlled, or will it be something that, in a sense, the environmental groups will be happy to see, like a river, go where it will go? What is your expectation of the degree to which the environmental movement will be a contributor, or possibly a constrainer, or possibly well, that's a very nice idea, but frankly it isn't very useful? You have the expertise, you know a great deal of the information, and certainly in the work with the faiths, we've encouraged them to partner with the relevant environmental groups, whether that's the Churchyards program here with the wildlife trusts, or whether it's, you know, the Catholic Church in the Amazon, very much linking up with traffic and WWF. So in terms of the knowledge you have, how do you see that feeding into something as popularist as the 8 billion? Is there a dynamic there that you hope for or plan for, or what?
I think the most we can hope for or plan for is the ultimate outcome that we would like to get to. I mean, essentially, an organisation like WWF is concerned with how do we stop what is potentially the 6th mass extinction, which is a terrifying prospect. Creating a movement or contributing to a movement, it's not a movement if it's controlled. And I think the nature of the movement is the breadth and the web of it. If many faith groups are part of the movement, they are also faith groups, but they are particularly acting on bringing to the fore issues of environmentalism, but also within that will be issues of social justice and equity. Yeah. So for me, it's a layering, and I think what we can do is contribute some of the content, some of the knowledge, some of the voices, the platforms, but this is about playing our part. This isn't about being it.
No. You made a choice to apply to be the CEO of WWF. If you look back on your life, was there a moment in which that was a logical outcome of something that you had experienced or felt or thought or encountered? What made you personally want to be in this work? Because it's a tough one. It's, as you say, it's in one of the most dramatic periods in human history. So where do you draw the strength from for knowing that this is where you ought to be personally?
Well, I think this role found me in a way. I've always cared about issues of social justice, and hence why I was working for Save the Children. And I kept getting calls about this role at WWF, joining to become the CEO. And for me, I couldn't quite place why I would contribute. And I received one of the many calls whilst being in Zimbabwe, up country in Binga. And I was there with colleagues responding to a food crisis. And the food crisis was driven by a very extreme El Nino event, and the sheer draining of resources in and around that setting. There were communities really struggling with food securities, close to starvation in some settings. And despite actually the many interventions by local government, it was difficult to get markets going. And I stood with a water engineer who was drilling for water and drilling and drilling, looking for that deep groundwater, and there was nothing there. And it's at that point that I could see the connectivity between the very deep issues in that particularly impoverished region, and the social justice issues, the real issues faced by communities, and the ecological crisis, and particularly the impacts from a climate change perspective. And that's the moment at which I felt that I might be able to make a contribution in a setting like WWF, to bring those challenges to life, but for me, absolutely also through an equality and a social justice perspective.
It's what the Pope calls an ecological conversion, I think. I'll mention it to him. Thank you. Thank you, Tanya.
No, thank you, Martin. Thank you.